All right, so welcome everybody. My name is Jacob McCormick. I have the pleasure of serving as the current chairperson of the Ingham County Historical Commission. A couple of our other presenters today are also members. I'll have them introduce themselves when they speak. But welcome to the Ingham County Home Cemetery. Of course, it's also known as the Poor House Cemetery, Poor Home Cemetery, Poor Farm Cemetery. Lots of names, but we'll talk about a little bit of that history today. But I just want to welcome you to the tour. We're going to give a brief sort of introduction on poor farms in general. I'll talk a bit about our specific poor farm, and then we'll go into each of our stops and talk about some of the individuals that are buried here. So I'll go ahead now and turn it over to Dr. Sarah Surface-Evans to give us an introduction here.
Thank you. So thanks for coming out today. This is, as I understand it, the first time we've done a tour here as part of the commission. So it's nice to have a crowd visiting us and joining us. As Jacob said, I'm Dr. Sarah Surface-Evans. I'm an archaeologist. I currently work for the state of Michigan in the State Historic Preservation Office. And just to give you a little bit of background, I have done work at poor farm cemeteries, not this one, but at other poor farm cemeteries as an archaeologist, helping to relocate or verify whether or not there were graves in areas that have been marked as cemeteries. This one is one of the rare cemeteries where we have a lot of markers, and there are probably more that are maybe not visible at this point. But there also it's rare to see that there are names on the markers at poor farms. So it shows, I think, a higher level of respect that the people here were treated than we see in some poor farm cemeteries. So as Jacob mentioned, I'm just going to talk a little bit in general. And can everybody hear me okay? Okay. So poor houses or poor farms were run by cities and counties throughout the United States as a means to provide care for unemployed citizens. Poor farms began in the early and mid-19th century and persisted into the 20th century until the Social Security Act of 1935. These institutions were in many ways symptoms of the Industrial Revolution and the economic stressors of the 19th century that prevented families and communities from being able to support each other and the indigent. Poor farms represent a movement to provide institutionalized relief for the poor while training them in skills that could contribute to the economy. Residents capable of manual labor were required to work at the farm and help maintain the facility. At least that's the ideal. As we'll see when we walk around, many of the markers show that the people who lived here and died here were very elderly. One row that I walked down earlier, almost all of the individuals buried in that row were in their 70s and 80s. So while they were able to contribute, I'm sure, to the workings of the poor farm, they weren't necessarily doing a lot of hard labor. So in reality, poor farms catered to a wide range of citizens who experienced poverty or homelessness, such as the elderly, disabled, orphaned children, widows, unwed mothers, and the mentally ill. As a result, they became the forerunner of many other institutions for social welfare, such as mental asylums, orphanages, nursing homes, and hospitals, even prisons. According to sociologist David Wagner, the history of poor farms is deeply intertwined with the history of poverty, old age, sickness, physical and psychological disability, child welfare, widowhood, single parenthood, treatment of deviants, unemployment, and economic cycles. The Ingham County Poorhouse is a good example of this, as it later became the Ingham County Infirmary, then the Ingham County Hospital, and eventually the Ingham County Medical Care Facility. So poor farms tend to be remembered as depressing places, and here we are in a cemetery, which kind of speaks to that. But there are many social reasons why they've taken on a negative aura over time. David Wagner calls poor farms a story of hope as well as pain. The pain is related to the ways in which residents of poor farms were often stigmatized. To be a resident of this facility required separation from society and often induced lifelong stigma of shame. In addition, the inadequate conditions of many poor farms and the fact that they cared for the elderly and ill meant that deaths were commonplace at poor farms. This is why they often had their own cemeteries, like we see here today. So what lends to the aura of sadness at poor farms is that those who lived and died in these places did so often anonymously. Due to the lack of funds, burial markers at poor farms are similar to paupers' graves in many poor farms. with only a small number of markers for burials. However, with archival research, it is possible to restore the names and the stories of the people who relied on these institutions through hard times. So that's part of what we're going to do here today, is to give you some of the actual personhood back to the individuals who lived and died here. So I'm going to pass it back over to Jacob, who's going to talk a little bit more about the Ingham County.
And before I do that, I just want to send these around. There's a couple copies, so you can kind of spread those out here. Those are images sort of related to the Ingham County Poor Farm specifically. I'll briefly introduce myself beyond being the chairperson of the Historical Commission. I have a background in history and library science. I currently work as an educator and photo archivist at the state capitol. So also involved in the County Historical Commission, Holt's Historical Society, and Lansing's Historical Society. So happy to talk about any of that today if there's interest. And the County Historical Commission does have a couple vacancies, so if any of you are interested in that, let's talk afterward and we'll see about getting you on the board. All right, so the Ingham County Historical Commission, the Ingham County Poor Farm, the Ingham County Poor Farm was established about 1843. Ingham County was required by state law at that point to form a tax and a board of supervisors or superintendents to oversee the poor and the needy in the county. And by 1884, they did that, and they established a poorhouse in Allerton Township. It was located on 80 acres at the southwest corner of Holt and Okemos roads, not too far from here. And they had originally appropriated $50 in 1844 for the care of all of the county's needy and poor. That poorhouse in Allerton Township burned in the 1870s. It actually killed 6 residents during that fire. But the house was rebuilt in 1878, and since the 1840s, the appropriations from the county had steadily grown. So by 1879, appropriations were $8,650 over 35 years. That's quite a big difference there, of about $8,600. And by that time, the poor farm had grown to 120 acres. They added to the size of the farm over time. In 1880, shortly after they rebuilt after the fire, they traded for that original farmland down in Allerton Township for this property in Meridian Township. And this, we're of course located on Dobie Road, and those old buildings in Allerton Township were sold by the county and moved to adjacent farms. So some of them might still be out there. I haven't looked into that personally, but it's very possible. And we located on this new land and built a new building. It was located a little ways away, sort of where the Carriage Lane Apartments is now, and there's a connection there that I'll talk about in a minute. But it was constructed with the idea that those in poor health, with disease, mental illness, or problems through which they lacked no other means of support. They often did not have families around for support. The county referred to these individuals as inmates, which is not exactly an accepted term for patients these days, but that's what they used then. And then S. Lee Cook was the individual who was the last keeper of the poor farm in Allerton Township, who was responsible for moving all of the individuals who were inmates at the time and the entire facility to Meridian Township. The poor farm changed to the county infirmary in 1921, which I understand was pretty consistent across the state. That sort of language changed around that time to become infirmaries. The building that they had built in 1880 burned here in the 1920s. At that time, it's believed that all of the records that predated 1920s were lost in that fire, and per the medical care facility and per the county, there are no surviving records from the historic poor farm for Ingham County. But you just never know what's going to turn up in somebody's attic or in a library or archive somewhere. So we'll keep optimistic that something is out there. They replaced that building in the 1920s, and a new infirmary was constructed, which had a capacity for 100 people. By 1947, the infirmary changed to the Ingham County Hospital, which was another sort of consistent transition across the state to becoming a hospital. And the name and purpose changed again in 1966 when the Ingham County Hospital became the Ingham County Extended Care Facility. That building that had been built in the 1920s was used until 1978, when this building right next to us was built in 1978, and it became what is now known as the Ingham County Medical Care Facility. And the old building built in the 1920s is what is now the Carriage Lane Apartments. It's still there. It's been renovated and it doesn't look to be that age, but it is. It dates to the 1920s. I will add that I think Sarah addressed this a little bit as well, but we're seeing large gaps here in the cemetery. So we believe this to be a full cemetery with either graves that are unmarked or have sunken their stones. And then I do want to briefly mention sort of research for poor farm cemeteries and poor farms in general. It can be difficult. Records don't always exist, and as I said, Ingham County's records are not believed to exist. But you can check out federal censuses, and the residents or the inmates of the poor farms will be listed generally together with the people who ran the farm, the keepers, and whatnot. Death certificates are an interesting tidbit as well. I found out while researching for this tour. So it will list that they died at the poor farm or the poor house, and the keeper or the superintendent is the informant. Parents are listed as unknown. Birthplace and birth date are listed as unknown. They had very little information about these individuals. That's not always the case. I'll talk about an individual later on in the tour today who did have family around. It has a fully populated death certificate, but still died at the poor farm. So it's an interesting sort of dynamic and total array of people who ended up here. And I think we'll get a good sort of variety today on the tour. So that's sort of the end of the introduction here. I do want to turn it over to Jesse Lasorda, who's going to talk to us about the historical marker, which was placed by the County Historical Commission, and then the bricks, stonework, or the brickwork around it. So I'll turn it over to you, Jesse.
Thank you, Jacob. I appreciate it. A lot of my background, I might add too, will mirror Jacob's. We seem to follow in the same path. I was a former Ingham County Historical Commissioner in the past, and am currently right now past president of the Lansing Area African American Genealogical Society. I was connected with the Fred Hart Williams Group, which is an African American Genealogical Society in Detroit. I've been a past member of Ingham County Genealogical Society. I'm a current member of Eaton County Genealogical Society. So a lot of this I've done a number of cemeteries over a period of time. Just before I talk about the brickwork specifically,
Step up, the road traffic's kind of loud.
into this area right here, think better. Before I talk about the brickwork, I wanted to mention too, we'll use Mount Hope Cemetery in Lansing as an example. Those that were indigent and poor, there is a section in Section C at Mount Hope Cemetery that is specifically nothing for but indigent veterans. And there are 48 men that are buried there. And that section had been restored a number of years ago in a collaborative effort, and I was involved with that too as well. So there are some other avenues for people that are poor, and that's an example one. And of course, there's also, especially Civil War veterans, but there are others, the Soldiers Home in Grand Rapids as well. So that's worth noting as well. What I wanted to make mention about this brickwork here is the person that had done this, his name is Doug Armstrong. He lives in DeWitt, Michigan. Doug is a mason by trade. As you can see, this is very well done. Doug had been involved with a number of projects in the area, including when the restoration project for the Capitol, I think it was in the 80s, wasn't it?
1987 to 1992.
I'm shocked that you knew that. But the stonework there, he was heavily involved with that when that restoration project occurred. Doug has done countless projects throughout this county, Clinton County, etc. He is also a member of the Sons of Union Veterans, so he's deeply connected with those groups as well. Saying that, Jacob?
If you throughout the cemetery, those are marking the graves that we're going to talk about today, and we'll start right here. Let's see, Jesse, you want to go first with one of your individuals here? So we'll start with Willie Brooks here, if that's all right with you, Jesse. All right, fantastic.
I do apologize to some extent because some of the things I'm going to say that I had written, some of us have already spoken on. So when I say spoken on, some of the things in regards to the cemetery and those that are buried here. So just if I'm redundant, I apologize. The unknown case of Willie Brooks, as you can see right here, like many of the burials at this cemetery, there are countless unknowns, as Jacob alluded to a few moments ago. Many of the burials in this cemetery were not residents at the Ingham County Poor Farm necessarily. As you can see, there are children that are buried here as well, and they certainly were not connected with the actual home itself. One will find countless spaces will appear to be empty in this cemetery, and as you can see, including Mr. Brooks, it's concrete. It's very Spartan, I guess would be the best way to say it. Very little known is about Willie Brooks before his death, especially after. On a warm June 23rd day of 1939, Willie's body was spotted floating in the Grand River near the Saginaw Street Bridge in Lansing by a resident at about 10 a.m. It was estimated his body had been in the warm waters of the Grand River for at least 3 days before being spotted. By all reports, the coroner did a superficial exam of the body, reporting it was a suspected drowning. In my research trying to locate Willie's obit in the Lansing State Journal, there was no Willie Brooks to be located. What was located was a drowning victim named Jack Hart, who died the 23rd of June of 1939 and was found in the exact same location. Per the obit, Jack Hart was employed for about 1 month as a salesman for the Lansing branch of the Kalamazoo Stove Company, as was asserted by his manager, Frack Callahan. Callahan believed that Jack Hart was approximately 38 years old, and he believed Hart had relatives but could not locate any of them. In my research in that obit, it mentioned Gorsline Funeral Home was the funeral home that took care of the services. They were responsible for the funeral. Sadly, the only information they had was the mother's name, Emma Brooks. No mention of a Jack Hart. On Willie's death certificate, it reported that his occupation as a carnival laborer. Place of his birth was unknown, and that was the case with his parents as well. Of course, the likely scenario, or on about June 23rd of 1939, the Lansing State area reported that a circus was being assembled at Ferris Park in Lansing. Willie Brooks likely traveled with that circus company as a laborer with little known about his background. There was also a search done for both Willie Brooks and Jack Hart in the Lansing city directories, and neither name could be found in the city directories. It is my belief, like so many other poor folks, in his particulars in regards to his life were of little consequence, which included his correct name, which was Willie Brooks, not Jack Hart. His headstone is made, of course, of concrete, and very little you will see on his headstone. Kind of piggyback a little bit on Willie Brooks. In 1930, many of us that live in this area are familiar with what was at one time one bridge crossing the Grand River on Logan Street. That bridge was built in 1930. There was a cofferdam that they had built. 8 men died in that cofferdam. Little is known about that, and little is said about that. It took months before all the bodies were finally found. Several of them are buried at Mount Hope Cemetery, but with little known about them as well. So this is not unusual, sadly. It's just the way of the times. Saying that, you may go next.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jesse. So we're going to do the next one over here. This is, interestingly enough, a similar story to what Jesse just told us about. So this is Charles Stiles, and his story is one of social welfare, sort of, in Lansing. And Charles Francis Stiles was born March 28, 1873. Now, his birth date varied from 1873 to 1879, but based on sort of comparing and contrasting, I think 1873 is more like it. He was born in Rochester, New York, to an English father, born in England, Joseph W. Stiles, and an Irish mother, born in Ireland, Mary A. Lynch. So it's already unique, kind of, that we have the person's family, their parents, right? He was described as short and stout, with light brown hair and gray eyes. He worked as a telegraph operator when he was still living in New York, in Rochester, around 1900. He did marry, which was not uncommon for those who ended up in the Poor Farm, but he married June 4th, 1906, to Ethel P. Greviot, I believe is how you pronounce her name. She was a stenographer who was from Grand Rapids. They married in Detroit, and Charles was working as a porter at this time in Detroit. By 1918, Stiles was also still living in Detroit. No indication of being married anymore. Couldn't sort that out. Perhaps there was a divorce, perhaps his wife died, different possibilities there. But this is when he registered for the World War I draft. He did not serve in the war, but registered for the draft. And he worked for the Imperial Shipbuilding Company in Detroit at that time. So we're going to get now to the end of his life. We're going to skip quite a few decades here. In 1939, May 1939, Charles Stiles receives his card, his registration card from the Lansing Transient Bureau. And he was also waiting to receive his old age assistance pension from the state of Michigan at that time. On June 12th, 1939, Charles had dinner at the Lansing Transient Bureau. He left the Transient Bureau later that evening. He's believed to have walked along the river. It was located on the river. I'll talk a little bit more about it in a minute here. But the Transient Bureau was on the river. He walked along the river and is believed to have fallen in the river around Shiawassee Street Bridge. So you get to the bridge, and the evening of June 12th, he's believed to have fallen in. 2 days later, June 14th, a Board of Water and Electric Light worker from the North Lansing Power Station discovered his body at the North Lansing Dam. The evening before his body was found, the dam was cleared of debris, and he was not found, so it's believed that he would have floated upriver to North Lansing at that time. His death was ruled as probably accidental. Of course, we have no way of knowing, but that was the conclusion. Now we get to his death certificate and sort of his afterlife here. So Charles' brother, William, who was still living in New York at the time, was the informant on his death certificate. He was the contact for the funeral home. Estes Ledley handled Mr. Stiles' remains. And he had 4 siblings that survived him, still living in New York. Arrangements were made by the family to have his remains returned to Rochester, New York, and a funeral to be held there after his death, and again for him to be buried there. However, according to Estes Ledley's records, there are crossed out plans and rewritten plans. So either the family decided it was not worth their time to bring him home, it was deemed not financially possible. Of course, they didn't have the money to bring him home, or any, of course, number of other reasons. So the Lansing Transient Bureau planned a small funeral for him. It was held at Resurrection Church in Lansing with Father Gabriel officiating, and the bill was charged to Ingham County. The funeral bill and the burial from Estes Ledley were charged to SS Maine County Welfare City Hall. That is, of course, Social Security, Maine County Welfare, City Hall, and Ingham County paid the $75 bill. Now, that was the case with most folks who died in the county poor farm, but as we'll talk about in a minute, the Transient Bureau was also connected to Ingham County. So let's talk briefly here about his connection with the Transient Bureau and with this old age assistance application that he was waiting on. So the Transient Bureau was located at 429 North Cedar Street. This was the historic James I. Mead House, which was located sort of where I think they're called the Riverview Apartments, so we're talking south of Saginaw, north of Shiawassee. So he would have walked south from there and it sort of landed at that Shiawassee Street Bridge. This old house, which was built about 1850, early on in Lansing's history, served as the Women's Hospital Association, the Visiting Nurses Association. It was an apartment briefly. It was a children's home. It was the Transient Bureau from about 1934 to 1940. It then became a craft space, and then for the longest time it was the Cedar Street Recreation Center. It was demolished in 1973, and most people who remember it as the Recreation Center. In July 1934, the Ingham County Emergency Welfare Commission, so it was an entity of Ingham County, which was funded by the U.S. FERA, the Federal Emergency Relief Act funds, extended their lease on the building of the James I. Mead House. So it had already existed by July 1934. And I got to switch pages here. And by December 1934, there was some like consistent activity. Like these men had a community going at the Transient Bureau. So they were producing a publication called The Buzzer, which was sort of a newsletter. They told their own stories. They made their lives known. There are no known surviving copies of The Buzzer that I know of. I've never found them anywhere. But they credited themselves as the unknown heroes of the Hotel Kearns fire in 1934, right around the corner on Michigan Avenue. And it's believed, my conclusion would be that some of the men from the Transient Bureau went down when this massive, devastating fire was happening and helped rescue people. And they told their story in The Buzzer. There was another transient home in Lansing. It was on a river street and operated by the Salvation Army. Sort of by the late 1930s, the Transient Bureau was no longer serving what they were referring to as transients, people who were sort of passing into town, expected to sort of be on their way and receiving short-term assistance to help them get on their feet. But it was considered to have essentially been a homeless shelter by 1939. Of the 91 residents in December 1939, 66 were permanent, long-time Lansing residents who were living there. We're of course talking about, at this point, the end of the Great Depression. People were not well off at that time. But the Transient Bureau, which was run by the County Social Welfare Board, provided registered men who were registered with them housing, compulsory baths, compulsory clothing, some work, and meals. So the policies were aimed at helping them get back on their feet, as I said, and not providing sort of a persistent place for them to live, but temporary. So they, in 1934, were offered 16 hours of work, which would pay for their shelter at the Transient Bureau and pay for their meals. They could work additional hours to have sort of extra money, but that was what they were offered. And then there was also men who were registered with them who could live elsewhere, live at hotels or boarding houses. They would work the same amount but would be given the money so that they could pay for their board and pay for their meals. So there was a couple options there. And by November 1939, that's sort of around the time that they think it's turning into a homeless shelter, the county says, okay, we're closing it down. We're no longer offering the Transient Bureau, but the state stepped in. So they decided that by January 1940, it was no longer to serve transients, but was to be called the Ingham County Bureau for Homeless and Unattached Persons. So they turned it into what the city didn't want it to turn into, essentially. And it didn't last much longer. It closed in the early 1940s. And this is sort of marking what was sort of the end of the Great Depression, but of course people were still in dire straits. And then let's circle back to the 1930s and talk about social welfare, sort of with the fact that when his body was found, his Transient Bureau card was found on his person, as was an application for that old age pension. That's how we know these facts about himself. These papers were on him. So in 1933, Michigan Governor William Comstock signed the Old Age Assistance Act into law. This gave assistance to people of a certain age and made county implementation of this mandatory. So people over the age of 70 could receive up to $30 monthly if they had lived in Michigan more than 10 years. This was the case. Stiles had lived in Michigan more than 10 years, but he was not over 70. In 1934, which was the year it was implemented, Michigan gave assistance to 2,660 seniors, totaling $306,096. By the end of the decade, 1939, Michigan gave assistance to 83,275 people, which totaled $1.4 million in aid. So that is quite an increase over 5 years there. In 1935, President Roosevelt signs the Social Security Act into law. That provided aid to Americans over the age of 65, but at this time, Charles was only 62, so he still didn't apply for, or didn't fit into the Social Security. He wasn't eligible yet, and at that time, the 1933 law in Michigan was sort of updated to comply with Social Security. Charles applied for Social Security in March 1937 on his 64th birthday. His family either couldn't or wouldn't. So this is a different look at the Poor Farm Cemetery. He did not live here. He lived in Lansing. He lived at the Transient Bureau. So it's just a different, unique look. Sort of an interesting connection that these two men were both found in the Grand River are buried next to each other here. So I will turn it back over to Jesse, and we will talk about your next individual then. Apparently, yeah. It's interesting, I know.
Well, that was most interesting due to the fact, especially to be very frank with you, with our busy lives, I had not a clue that we had two drowning victims right next to each other, to be very frank with you, to this very moment. But saying that, this particular person is Ernest Brown. I'll start off by saying he was a man of color. Ernest Brown was a man of color who grew up in a very segregated times in the country, let alone the city of Lansing. At the time in which he was growing up in Lansing, if those of us here that are familiar with Lansing, where Westmoreland is, where the Grand River is, a short distance on the west side of Lansing, where West Saginaw is, and Butler Street to the east, African Americans were very segregated to that area of town. There was a few exceptions to that, but not very many. Ernest was born in Canada in approximately 1869. In 1890, he came to Michigan, keeping in mind one could walk or drive across the Canadian border unimpeded in 1890. In 1900, Ernest was living at 408 Kalamazoo Street in Lansing with his mother, Margie. He was a teamster by trade at this time. By 1920, he was the owner-operator of his own team of horses and wagons, living at 1465 Glen Rose in Lansing. Census takers in 1920 indicated he was born in 1860 and was born in Michigan, and parents were United States citizens. So it just depends from each 10-year period what you might find on the census. Not always accurate depending on who they got the information from, of course. He was able to read and write, which wasn't always the case for men of color, let alone men, period, because they left school very early to farm. By 1930, Ernest was living at 510 Willow in Lansing, working as a janitor. The census record implied that he was married when, at the time when he was, not at the time, but when he was 20 years old. I found no records of him being married. Per the 1930 census, his parents and himself, they indicate by then he was born in Canada. Census takers were all over the board with race. We talked about this to a few people here before this this walk started. He was listed as black, Negro, mulatto over 30 years span. Saying that also gave you some opportunities if you were mulatto versus black. If the census taker came to your door, it could make a world of difference where you were going to live in the city of Lansing. There was a handful of people of color in Lansing that lived beyond those borders I described earlier because they were fair complected. So it made a huge difference. Also made a difference of some of the governmental jobs that African Americans were able to get at the time as well. From approximately 1924, Ernest was a caretaker at the woman's home at 510 Willow in Lansing. Roughly, that is immediately, the building still stands, it's immediately next to the Consumers Power Building that's located on Willow, not far from Pine Street area of the old school for the blind.
That woman's home used to be 2 stories, and when they put fire restrictions on, they knocked the top story off, so it's currently a 1-story home there.
Correct.
It used to be 2 stories in the 50s and 40s and 50s and 60s.
Yeah, I remember very distinctly, especially in the 60s. I lived on Walnut Street at the time. So literally I lived around the corner from the building. This woman's home was not only his place of work, but also his primary residence as well. He took on multiple roles as a caretaker, janitor, and security. One can only imagine the respect the staff and, more importantly, the residents of the woman's home for Ernest, especially considering this was the 1920s and 30s for a man of color. Ernest worked at the women's home from 1924 through approximately 1932. Ingham County Infirmary, where he passed on March 23, 1935, he was close to 70 years old at the time. And as it was mentioned just a few seconds ago, the women's home still exists. That's still on Willow, and by the way, it's for sale. Saying that, we
will move along to the other section of the cemetery here. I think we will probably talk about Joseph Dorsey next, if Mitch and Linda want to take over the microphone.
Okay. This gentleman right here is named Joseph Joe Dorsey. He is also an African American, and as you can imagine, early record keeping is hit or miss. He was born in Virginia, we believe in 1814, but various research records also note possible birth years of 1815, 1816, and 1818, and I'm not sure his tombstone information is correct, frankly. He had repeatedly said he was born in Virginia, but he did mention that his parents were born in West Virginia. Now, what's interesting about that is there was no West Virginia until January 1st, 1863, when the hill portion of Virginia, which was largely small itinerant farmers and not real proponents of slavery, were sick and tired of the Tidewater region of Virginia running to things, and in order for Lincoln to get 2 Republican senators, they broke off. So it leads me to believe that Joe Dorsey had contact with his parents in West Virginia, or wanted it to be known that his parents were living in West Virginia, even though his birth in 1814 was listed as Virginia. It could have actually been what we call today modern West Virginia. By 1860, he is in Farmington Township in Farmington, Michigan. I'm not sure if he was an enslaved person with his family or not, but by 1860, before the Civil War breaks out, he is in the north in Michigan, living with the John Murdoch family. They were Irish immigrants, and they were farmers. Unfortunately, and Linda will show this, we have a little display at the end here, the handwriting of his occupation is really hard to make out. But he has some sort of skill that the census people believe needed to be noted. We believe it's master something. And he was known for eventually making hand-rolled cigars and cigarettes for many years. So we're trying to figure out Master Buncher as a possibility that was actually a name given to people that could roll cigars and cigarettes. So he's in there in 1860. In 1870, he moves to Langsburg in Shiawassee County. He is living in the Palmer Hotel, or the Wilbur Hotel. I'm still doing research. It was called the Palmer-Wilmer Residence. It was a small hotel. Here, the census indicator that he was born in 1817 in Virginia. Again, his occupation is hard to decipher, but it looks like master something. He also is living in that place next to or sharing a room with another African American gentleman who is a year older than him, who was a barber. So we thought that was very unique. A woman from Weberville about 60 years ago wrote a book and mentioned Joe Dorsey. In 1880 lived in Weberville, but we think her memory was a bit in error because in 1880 he's in the Williamston census. So sometime between 1870 and 1880 he does spend some time in Weberville, Michigan, and in 1880 he is living in the Andrews Hotel in downtown Williamston, which if you've ever been to Williamston, there's 4 corners with the light. It would be the northwest corner. Now it's Dollar Times and a retail store and a jewelry store. So he was living in there in 1880. Again, he noted that both of his parents were born in West Virginia. It noted that he was born in 1815, and his occupation was night watchman. Sometime later on in the 1880s, 1890s, he moves to another hotel in Williamston, which is no longer standing. It's now a residence on East Middle Street and South Putnam Street. And that building was torn down and replaced by another building during World War I. During that time, he worked for a cigar maker in town named C.W. Ainsley as somebody that sold tobacco and rolled tobacco. We believe that that office was probably in the Andrews building or the one next to it, because Ainsley moved around a little bit. During that time, apparently Joe Dorsey was known as Old Joe as a nickname, and there is, and we're tracking this down, there was a brand of cigar locally sold called Old Joe, and on the cigar box was an apparent picture, whether it was painted or sketched, of Old Joe, and apparently there is one in existence in Lansing. I'm trying to run down. So he was somebody that was very well known in the area, living in, if you don't know, Langsburg, Weberville, and Williamston are about 8 miles apart in a circle. So this would be a gentleman that would have lived more than 2 decades. Eventually he ends up by 1900 census at the Poor Farm here. He dies on October 9th, 1904, which was a Sunday morning. And then he was buried Monday afternoon right here in the cemetery here. His cause of death was old age and the catarrh of the bowels, which was also called bloody flux and bloody piles, depending upon your era. And that was basically infection, also known as dysentery, for ingesting spoiled water, usually or contaminated water. The notice of his death was printed in at least one newspaper. The Ingham County Democrat mentioned that he had died, and their little subheading of doings, goings on in Meridian and Alladin areas in the county. On his death certificate, it had unknown information on parents, on his birth location, or anything like that. So Old Joe was somebody that was actually pretty well known. Now Linda, who serves with me on the Williamston Museum at the depot, has some visuals and a couple of stories because she knows about Old Joe through her grandparents. So Linda, you're going to need the microphone.
Do I need the microphone?
I can hold that for you if you want, Linda, so you can point to it.
Okay.
Do it.
What you want?
You can go ahead.
Here. Oh, okay, you're going to hold that.
Yep.
I was going to read my notes on the back.
Okay.
Well, you've already heard the source. I spent a great deal of time with my grandparents when I was younger, and their favorite times to spend was relaying the history of Williamston and the people who lived there. Over the years, the research I've done about the history has proven their stories to be 95% accurate, so I believe what I have to tell you is true. My grandfather was 8 when Mr. Dorsey died, so he was relaying his parents' stories. But I would have to say Joe Dorsey was known to have rolled the best cigars men in Williamston had ever smoked. And he had a stand that he sat at in front of the Andrews Hotel where he would sell his cigars. My grandparents never said anything derogatory about him, but I knew from what they said that he was not treated well because he was a person of color. And the last place he lived before he moved to the poorhouse was every evening he would sleep at the city jail. And at that point I would always ask my grandparents why, and then they would just kind of go, I don't know. So that was all the information I got about Joe Dorsey.
And you can see we've got his death certificate here, and if you can make out his census master and master, we would love to figure out what it is. We think it's Buncher, but if you have a discerning eye for cursive writing, which I think eliminates anybody on the age of 30, And it was the whole people with the cursive writing reading skill. You can look at this when we're done with the tour and help us. And I will be doing more research on Joe Dorsey and writing another Williamston history book, my second, and we're going to have a chapter on Joe Dorsey because we think he's kind of a cool guy.
You know, one thing Mitch did not do, although we didn't poke and prod him very much, but you should plug your book on Negro League Baseball.
Oh, yeah, I wrote a book a couple of years ago. I wrote a book a couple of years ago on the Page Fence Giants, which was an African-American championship baseball team in the 1890s. Organized in Adrian, Michigan, and they played in Lansing. And Bud Fowler, who was just inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame this summer by Dave Winfield's speech, African-American gentleman who played for the Lansing minor league team for a short bit, organized a team, and it was named a Michigan Notable Book in 2019. So I still do talks and give lots of speeches on that. I got a talk coming up. So I'm doing that, and I've written 2 other books, including one on Williamston history, and I'm working on another one.
You bet. Thank you, Mitch. I might mention, too, it's kind of connected to what Mitch was just talking about. Many here probably do know this, but where Deepdale Cemetery is currently right now, immediately east of that is Waverly Hills subdivision, and that's where Ledley Park and Waverly Park was located at one time, and especially during the summer months, tens of thousands of people would come there to watch baseball games, including Negro League baseball games. And it was an incredible park that many don't know about. I would gather most don't. When I describe where it's at, most folks just kind of roll their eyes like, I don't have a clue. But anyways, I just thought I'd mention that too as well. I'm going to talk about, we had difficulty trying to get, and I probably researched 7 or 8 different women that are here, but there's very few women that are here, and especially any information on the women. And although I'm standing in front, slightly off a bit, under Byron Mason, his wife was Caroline. And Caroline does not have a headstone, at least we don't believe that's here, and if it is here, it's probably buried underneath the soil. Caroline was born in approximately 1866. In 1900, Michigan census indicated her birth year and month was unknown, which was common as many were born at home and being reported to the county officials sometimes later, if at all. Caroline's father was Hiram Gardner. Her mother was Caroline Camp. Both were born in the United States. Caroline was married twice. Her second marriage was to Byron Mason right here. She mothered 5 children, 3 from the second marriage and 2 from the first marriage. She married Byron Mason the 19th of February of 1891 in Mason, Michigan. The couple had 3 children, Iva and Roy. The third child was stillborn. Byron was a farmer by trade. By 1900, the company were living in Vevay Township, Ingham County, Michigan. Byron was a farmer, was a farm laborer at 21 years old in 1870, and in 1880 was still living in Ingham County, working for a large farm owner. His family moved to Meridian Township by 1860. His father and his mother's names were unknown. Caroline, sometime between 1910, ended up getting tuberculosis and was, as Jacob mentioned earlier, I hate to use the word, but it was part of the census record, and she was an inmate at the Ingham County Poorhouse for at least 4 years. TB first came to the U.S. by the way of seals and seal lions. There was no reliable treatment for TB early on. Some physicians prescribed bleeding and purgings, but most often doctors simply advise their patients to rest, eat well, and exercise outdoors. I believe PBS had done a story recently on tuberculosis and also connected with polio, that the benefits of sunlight was incredible. Putting people outside in hospital beds and them getting sunlight made all the difference in the world to a lot of patients. Many cemeteries isolated those with TB, which could possibly explain why you see no headstone. Mount Hope Cemetery example in the city of Lansing, a lot of the folks that were isolated were to the extreme south in that cemetery. Having TB for over 4 years, one can only imagine the suffering. Sadly, many patients were literally dropped off at the front door and left to their own demise. It's a hard thing to say, but from all the records we've seen, it just would indicate that was the case a lot of times. And I'm sure there was a lot of fright, too, about various diseases and what they may end up getting. Caroline passed June 21st, 1914. And as I mentioned earlier, she has no headstone. Both Caroline and Byron, her husband, are buried in the cemetery. Byron passed the 25th of April of 1908. Now, kind of a side note connected to where we're standing, not necessarily the cemetery, but at least this community. Many may know this, some may not. This very community we stand in was once known as Hamilton, named after an early pioneering family, the Hamiltons. Hamilton Road was named in behalf of James Hamilton, likely the last Civil War soldier to die in the greater Lansing area, December of 1941. James Hamilton enlisted at the tender age of 15 years old as a drummer. He survived the war, returned to Lansing, where his home on Walnut Street still stands. He was a longtime commander of the Charles Foster GER post. Those that don't know what the GER is, it was a veterans organization equivalent to the VFW today. He is buried at Deepdale Cemetery, Eaton County. Many of Hamilton's kin live in Mason to this very day. David Hoflinger is one of his kins. David has a collection that's connected to that GER post and of his kin that's just absolutely incredible. Saying that, Jacob?
So I just want to add one note here before we go on to our last stop. Being that both Byron and Caroline are buried here, I would think, I didn't look into it super in depth, but I would think it unusual to have both people of a couple, husband and wife, to be buried in a poor farm cemetery. Again, don't know if they might be the only one here. Again, didn't look into it, but I just wanted to point that out. I found that fascinating. So I want to head up here. We'll head to our next stop. The pumpkin here somewhere. There it is. Yeah, absolutely. All right, I'm going to step into the shade. But here, this is the grave we're talking about, of David Winchell. And there's not a lot to say about him. I'm going to just preface this, but there's a little bit, and it's kind of an interesting situation anyway. So David Winchell was born in Victory, New York, in July 8th, 1830, to James Winchell, who was a veteran of the War of 1812, and Elizabeth Wakely. His mother died when he was 14 in 1844, and his father remarried to a woman named Emmeline Beers around 1845. The family then, he and his stepmother, his full siblings, and his the beginning of his half-siblings, moved to Genesee County, Richfield, in Genesee County in 1847. He was 17 at that time. By 1850, his older brother Nathan moved to Stockbridge. A couple of years later, about 1853 or so, his other older brother William also moved to Stockbridge. They had two large farms in Stockbridge. And in a 1869 published genealogy of the family, David is listed as having been married and was living in West Michigan, or had removed to West Michigan. Now, there's no record of his marriage, and there's no record of him living farther west than Stockbridge. So I suppose that if the genealogy were published in Detroit, Stockbridge could be considered West Michigan in that time frame. But that's just my conclusion there. He is in almost no records for the rest of his life. He doesn't appear in any census records that I could find until 1900, and there's just almost nothing. He just vanishes from the records. In 1900, he is living in Stockbridge with his brother Nathan's family, and in 1900, he's also listed as widowed in that census, so that is another piece of evidence that he had been married, but again, no information other than that. His brother died in 1900, sometime after the census was taken. Also living in the household at that time was Nathan's wife, adult daughter, and her family with grandchildren there. This left David as the last of his siblings. There were 5 or 6 of them, and he was the last one alive. By the summer of 1901, the year after his brother died, he became a resident of the Ingham County Poor House, or the county house as they called it at that point. And it's not clear why he ended up here. He had family. He was the last of that generation, but there were dozens of nieces and nephews. These are large families out in Stockbridge, and that's not far. You're right. We're right in Ingham County, so there was family around. I just found it fascinating that their uncle ended up at the Poor Farm, but again, it could very well have been a sickness, an illness like tuberculosis. His death on his death certificate is very much illegible, and I struggled with it for quite a while to make it out. I didn't bring a copy to have our experts here take a peek at it, but we don't know what he died of, but he became a resident in the summer of 1901 here, and died in March 1904. So he was here for a couple of years, 2.5 years. And he was 76 years old when he died, and he was listed as a laborer at the county farm. So he was still at least somewhat well enough to have been working at the farm when he died. And so that's what we know about David Winchell. But I just wanted to briefly mention him because it was such a big family. He had family in the area, and even though he had family in the area, we had unknown parents on the death certificate, unknown birth date, unknown birthplace. So the informant as well was the keeper of the poorhouse. So just total disconnect from the family, even though there is a large family plot out in Stockbridge as well in their cemetery. So just unique situations all around. Everybody here has a unique story to tell. They are difficult to research, but I would encourage all of you to not literally but figuratively dig around in the cemetery. I'll try to find some people, to find their stories. This cemetery sits here, and I would say almost never is visited. People run by, walk by. We've had that happen all day. You drive by all the time, but these are people whose lives ended, for the most part, right here, and worked here for many years, and this is their final resting place, and they are all but forgotten. They didn't have family for the most part. That's why they're here. So having this tour, allowing us to tell a few stories anyway, has been a great opportunity, and I'd encourage you to come back every once in a while, pick up some sticks, clean it up for them. It's clearly mowed still, but some of those sunken stones could use a little love. So if you're ever interested in doing that, I'd encourage you to do it. Just pop back in and visit the folks here at the Poor Farm Cemetery. And if you didn't, on the way in, take a peek at the historical marker, which was put up by our organization probably 25 years ago at this point. So take a peek at that as well. Yeah. Right there, absolutely. On the other side of Jolly, yep. I couldn't say for sure, but it's a thing to look into for sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
Have you had the cadaver dogs come in to sniff?
Have not. No, have not.
I can give you the
Okay. And we've talked about ground penetrating radar from some archaeologists. Luckily, we have a connection to that as well, potentially.
We know people.
Yeah. But yeah, I would be very interested to see, how full potentially the cemetery is, if there are stones that are knocked over. Of course. So there's a lot of work to do, and I would encourage, if there, are high school history classes or honors students who wanted to come clean up and dig up some of these stones here that are buried. That would be fantastic. That would, I think the county would appreciate that, and as long as we're not damaging the stones when we're trying to get them out, it's a good project and worthwhile.
Have you ever talked to the schools like Okemos
Yeah, so the transcriptions that we have were done by an Okemos middle school class, I believe. There's also a DAR transcription that was done in the 1930s. It lists some of these stones, but again, a couple of the people I talked about are not even listed on it, including Mr. Winchell, who would have been buried here when it was done. So I don't know how. Correct. So the DAR would have been adults, but I think a middle school, Kinawa, is it a middle school, did a transcription at some point in either the 90s or the early 2000s. So I think that's it. That last row there before the trees. So the county, I believe, still owns it, and it's controlled somewhat just by proximity by the medical care facility. As far as I know, the county, either parks or facilities or somebody would mow it unless they subcontract it out. And I couldn't say this for sure, but we're the Ingham County Historical Commission. We're appointed by the Board of Commissioners to report to them on all matters related to history. So, again, I'm not going to say this for sure, but I would say that we could probably give you permission to do it. And if it's a large project that wanted to come about, let us know, and we can ask around. But I think that we would have the authority to give permission to do that.
In the county clerk, their responsibility is to know who maintains all the cemeteries in the county. They'll direct you as to who does and who doesn't. North Cemetery in Lansing, this happened about probably 7 or 8 years ago. There was a Catholic church/school out here in Okemos. They had done a lot of caretaking of that cemetery. There was probably 100 kids that showed up, and they just absolutely went through North Cemetery in Lansing and did a fantastic job. So.
Is that St. Martha's?
Yes.
These up here on the hill all have stones. Down there it's flat. You think those are older and the first people that were buried here?
Nope,
And then
those are later.
the older ones. Those are later?
Those are later,
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And
So pretty much nobody was buried here before 1900. I don't see.
About 1890 is the earliest marked grave,
Yeah.
and then about 1941 is the latest marked grave.
Yeah.
Yep, but they were on this site in 1880, and that's a decade of folks who died here, and I would imagine that they're buried here. Yeah.
just a side note, speaking of, because I did one lady, the earliest person born that I found in here was born in 1794. So, that's a couple years ago, to say the least. But what happens with a lot of these stones, of course, is there's no footing underneath of them at all. And a lot of military headstones that are brass, that are flat, they have a footing. A lot of them do. And so they'll sink. But even the ones with concrete, I've been involved with probably close to 250 veteran headstones from the Civil War, World War I, and Spanish-American War, and we've seen them with concrete sink, with not sinking, and Sarah mentioned it early on, and then you got critters that, that compromise the footings with them as well.
The action of the soil also just causes things to heave and then sink over and over again over decades.
Absolutely. So, yeah, it would be most interesting, and, they're going to be most likely proportionally spaced, but Sarah mentioned earlier too, and it's point taken, is what happens a lot of times too is if a stone gets knocked off its grave site or gets pushed, who knows where it might end up. I've been in cemeteries down in Cass County where they're all against the fence. Just a side note too, that what happens at cemeteries at times is in St. John's, one of the city cemeteries there, every single one of the GAR markers or veteran markers was pulled up by one of the sextons. He pulled up every single one of them because they did not want to weed whack around them. They threw them in an outbuilding, and then a sexton afterwards, all he could do was to take a guess the time frame, a Civil War veteran versus a World War I veteran. So it happens, and Mount Rest. Yes.
because they're so random ones, and they have a sign up there that has probably about 150 names, and it says, we know they're buried here, but we don't know where.
Oh, absolutely. I'm working on a project right now down in Cass County. It's in Kelvin Center. This cemetery is predominantly 95% African American, and there are dozens and dozens, probably the largest collection of Civil War veterans that were African American that served or are at one of these particular cemeteries. And a lot of times, both white and black folk, a lot of the sections couldn't read and write too, so that made it difficult on top of it. So you add that combination of both of those things together, and some of the things you find at times is saddening. You know, loss. When we restored this veteran section C at Mount Hope Cemetery, we were walking in a path that led up to the other burial sites. Unbeknownst to us, we had no idea these folks had never got a headstone. They were World War I and earlier, and so we thought we were all done with the restoration project. We were going, oh, happy day. We had the ceremony all set, and then we find out, okay, we got to order 5 more headstones. 3 were Civil War veterans, and 2 were World War I. So you never know at times, to say the least.
Question. What do you know about this headstone over here that says baby, and I think it says the little baby died in 1835?
Yeah. Oh, does it say 35? So that's the next thing I was actually going to mention was children.
Maybe I've got it. I don't have my glasses on.
1940. So this baby died. This one here died in 1940. I did want this one 1895.
Oh, that's 1895.
Yeah, but I did want to talk about children. So these were likely infants, newborns, or stillborns who died with their parents living here. Children didn't stay at the poor farms. They were sent to Coldwater to the state school, and in some of the early reports related to the statewide reports for the county poor farms, it told for Ingham County that there was an adjacent district school that some of the kids went to, which I think would have been a relatively unique circumstance, but most of them would have been sent to Coldwater. That was where orphans and children who needed extra care and the education would have went. Yeah, so there's no records of the burials, so the only lists we have were transcriptions of the stones. There was one done in the 1930s and another done, I think, in the 1990s. I have a copy of the 1930s one with me today. It's not on our website, but we can probably make it available on our website. And we can also share it on social media. It's only like 6 pages long, but it also lists every cemetery in Meridian Township, which is interesting. And it tells if a person died at the poor farm and was given back to their family, or if they're buried here. So some interesting details, but not the greatest. I wish we had better records. The cemetery is on Find a Grave. I don't know if it's entirely pictured, but there are also people listed on Find a Grave that people probably added from records that don't have headstones. So it's there. You could definitely peruse it that way as well. Any other questions? Yeah.
Well, at one point, I know burial permits were required that were to be filed with township clerks.
Mm-hmm.
And has there been any effort to look to see if Meridian Township still has them? I know they're hard to find.
Yeah, I have not, no. And so would it have been Meridian Township, or would it have been a county since it's owned by the county?
Well, I believe, my understanding, it's in the Michigan genealogy book by Carol McGinnis. She mentions it in there that there was supposed to be, when a body was buried within a particular municipality, there was supposed to be a burial permit that went with it.
Interesting.
And that would be filed at the municipality.
Okay,
and so
I haven't looked into that. That's interesting.
Like I said, I know they're hard to find because those are probably the things that get tossed out.
Right.
But that would be one way that you wouldn't see like the order or anything like that.
But you'd get a list sort of at least.
Yeah. Of like who should have been here because it would have been filed.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, that's something to look for sure. Thanks for that. All right. Good. Well, I don't see any other questions, so thanks everybody for coming today. If you have any questions you want to check about privately, you're welcome to. Yeah.
What did you say about Find a Grave again? Because if the cemetery is not listed, if I went and...
It is. It is on Find a Grave, yep. And I believe it's been fully transcribed and photographed, but there are people listed
as buried there who do not have photographs of their stones. So I think people have added them from records.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then there's no picture to go with it.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. Well, you drive by here all the time.
Absolutely,
and
you do.
Never notice
You
it.
don't know what's there,
Isn't that
exactly.
sad?
Yes, it is. It really is.
Wow.
Creamy.
Oh, this
Yeah.
is really nice.
Thank you for coming today. Absolutely. There's that, right?
Okay.